So if we think back to Wilson's 14 points that we talked about when we discussed liberalism and his plan for sort of stabilizing the international system after World War I, one of the central pieces of that was this idea of collective security. And I'd like to talk about collective security, both some of its promises and some of its limitations for making the international system a little bit more stable. The idea of collective security is nothing sort of radically new. States have oftentimes looked to build security relationships with other states in order to improve their own situation in terms of alliances, whether those are defensive alliances like NATO that operates on the principle that an attack on one state and one member of NATO is an attack on all, or just simply arms sales and military cooperation to sort of share the load of developing a modern industrial military. I could point to a joint fighter jet program between Britain and France as an example of countries coming together, sharing resources, making their militaries interdependent in a way that reduces the burden and allows for them to improve their security situation. The problem with alliances, and the reason why I think that sort of age-old pattern of alliances doesn't quite work from a collective security perspective, is that while alliances create increased security for states that are members of the alliance, right? A state like Belgium or the Netherlands could never achieve the kind of security that it gets from NATO on its own, right? It's greatly enhanced by being a member of the NATO alliance. Those alliances can be seen as threatening to states that are not members of the alliance. And I think the sort of quintessential example of this is at the end of the Cold War, NATO began expanding eastward and gobbling up states that had previously been members of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet-led alliance bloc. And as Poland and Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and others began integrating into NATO, Hungary, Romania, Russia began a conversation with the NATO leadership and with the United States about possibly joining NATO, and was told categorically that no, they were not allowed to join NATO, that NATO was not for Russia, and the implication was NATO is about containing Russia. NATO is about weakening or limiting Russia. And so Russia came away from that conversation, that talk, with a real paranoia that NATO was marching to its borders and has been very concerned about growing Western influence in Georgia or growing Western influence in Ukraine, and has worked very hard to try to keep those as bastions of sort of pro-Russian support. And I think that is part of the legacy of what has happened recently with Russia and Ukraine is this sort of sense of NATO's on the march eastward, and Russia needs some sort of buffer against that. And this is a pretty typical sort of reaction to states forming alliances, that those who are outside see that as threatening. Wilson sort of saw that, and he sensed that the way around that is not to have different alliance blocks or different competing alliance blocks in states and out states, but instead to create a universal alliance system, a system in which everybody is a member of a shared alliance community, a shared security community. And that was sort of the vision of the League of Nations, that you're going to create this international organization that everybody can belong to, that's committed to this idea that aggression is not to be used in the international system, and that the international community will respond and come to the aid of states that are being attacked by aggressors. That was the plan. That was the vision. There were some potential challenges with the League of Nations. One of the challenges was its organizational structure and its decision-making structure. There was an executive council that was sort of similar to the Security Council in the United Nations today, but that executive council required unanimity to act. There were anywhere from, I think, 8 to about 15 different members at any given time, and you had to have all of those states voting in favor of an action in order for the League of Nations to respond. And as a result, it was really hard to get the League of Nations to do anything that was difficult. And for that reason, the League of Nations has this reputation of being ineffectual. And I think that that's a little bit too strong, because if you look at the history of the League of Nations over that 20-year period between World War I and World War II, they were dealing with dozens of international crises, border disputes in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire and the former Ottoman Empire. They were dealing with tensions in the Nordic countries over islands. They were dealing with uprisings in Germany. They were responding to a lot of crises on sort of a small scale, but they weren't able to stop World War II. And the reason why the League of Nations was created was to essentially stop a second world war, a second cataclysmic confrontation. And so in that sense, the League of Nations did fail, and failed pretty spectacularly. And when we look at it, what sort of drugged down the League of Nations, we could point to maybe power politics, that states didn't feel ready to commit resources to fight and share the burden of containing aggressive states like Imperial Japan, like Nazi Germany, like the Soviet Union. And in some instances, it was just really hard to identify who the aggressor was. And so I'd point to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria that was sort of a precursor to the larger World War II conflict. And as Japan's invasion of Manchuria doesn't begin with, Japanese generals saying, we're invading China, we've decided to do this. Instead, what they do is they have investments in China. They're building a railroad system in China, and there's an attack on that railroad. A bridge is blown up or something, and the Japanese military declares that in order to protect its investment, in order to protect that railway system, they need to move in and provide security. And so they move into China to provide security for this railroad, and in the process take huge chunks of China. China cries foul. They go to the League of Nations. The League of Nations says, well, maybe this is an invasion. And Japan says, no, it's not an invasion. It's a security operation. Why doesn't the League of Nations send a committee to China to check out what's happening? And so the League of Nations sends this committee, and it dilly-dallies for 6 to 8 months, researching what's happening and writing a report. And when it finally does write a report, it says, well, it seems like there may have been provocation, but it also seems like maybe Japan went too far, and maybe that's a problem. It was a very, wishy-washy, limited report, to which Japan said, I can't believe this, and storms out of the League of Nations, and Germany leaves with them. And the League of Nations essentially does nothing. And so you can see that while the League of Nations may have had this grand vision, it wasn't able to live up to it in that instance. When World War II was sort of underway, there was a meeting between Roosevelt and Churchill at the Atlantic Council, in which they got together and began hashing out a plan for a new revised League of Nations system, one that would work better. And at the end of World War II, there was a big meeting in, I think, San Francisco that sort of hammered out the details of this. But the thinking was that the decision process needs to be streamlined, right? There's still sort of an executive council that's responsible for making security decisions. Now it's called the Security Council instead of the Executive Council. But instead of giving every member a veto, instead of requiring unanimity, what they've done is they've created these permanent 5 members, the powerful states, the victors of World War II, that have a veto. They have to be in agreement. And then beyond that, the 10 to 15 members of the Security Council also have to vote and have a majority agreement. And so it's a slightly lower threshold. There's still this power politics dimension of states maybe not wanting to commit resources, of states, being in competition with each other, but now it's sort of built in. Now there's a need for the powerful states to sit down and negotiate and hammer out a solution if anything is going to happen. And there's a recognition that these powerful states are really going to be the core of any action if it's going to be taken. It doesn't solve the problem of how do you identify the aggressor. It doesn't solve the problem of the pretext that Japan had going into China, and whether or not that's a legitimate pretext or not a legitimate pretext, and how quickly you hash that out. So let's look at some successful examples of the UN system and collective security, and we have essentially 2. One came fairly quickly after the United Nations system was created. The other took a little while. The first was North Korea's invasion of South Korea. This was a fairly clear-cut act of aggression. At the end of World War II, the United States was occupying the south of the Korean Peninsula. The Soviet Union was occupying the north. Both the United States and the Soviet Union agreed that they would withdraw. There would be a referendum on what would happen to the Korean Peninsula. That referendum never happened. As the Soviet Union withdrew, they left behind their tanks and their artillery, and the North Korean military picked that up and went south. They were able to conquer most of the southern part of the Korean Peninsula. The United Nations springs into action. It authorizes a military force to push North Korea back, and that goes to the Security Council, and then the United Nations sends a international force led primarily by the United States, which I think had about 96%, the British, the Australians, and the Canadians. It was a very Anglo-heavy coalition, making up sort of most of the remainder, and they were able to push North Korea back toward roughly its starting point, with a few twists and turns along the way. The question of how was that able to work, how were you able to get the Security Council to take action, is a little bit of a quirky moment in Security Council history. So China's seat at the Security Council was being held by Taiwan at that particular moment. The nationalist forces in China had been defeated by the communist forces in China. The nationalists, who had sort of been the recognized government, fled to Taiwan and retained the China seat at the Security Council. The Soviet Union found that completely absurd. They saw that the Taiwanese, or the Chinese nationalist government in Taiwan was controlling just a tiny island, while the Chinese communists controlled the entire country of China, and they found it so absurd that they boycotted the Security Council and weren't there to cast a veto. And so you were able to get the 4 members that were there, Taiwan representing China, the United States, France, and Britain, that had vetoes, voting in favor. And so it was kind of a quirk. Shortly after that vote was held, the Soviet Union withdrew its boycott, returned to the Security Council, and essentially paralyzed the Security Council with tension between the United States and the Soviet Union from then on. That sort of stalemate between the United States and the Soviet Union holds for most of the Cold War period, but in 1990 we see another example of collective security working. In 1990, Iraq invades Kuwait. The United Nations Security Council meets. They authorize a force to push Iraq out of Kuwait. That force is made up of a slightly more international coalition. This time it's only about 90 to 92% American forces, with a coalition of Arab and other forces making up the remaining 8 to 10%. Again, this comes at sort of a weird moment in Security Council history. Normally you would have China or the Soviet Union casting a veto against the United States action, but by 1990, the United States and China were still part of a détente, or an alliance against the Soviet Union that had been growing and strengthening since the 1970s. And so the United States and China were fairly close at that moment, and China wasn't going to veto the operation that the United States was pushing for. And the Soviet Union, which normally would have vetoed the operation, was going through chaos of its own. It was letting loose of its empire in Eastern Europe. It was facing internal chaos, and essentially Mikhail Gorbachev, the head of the Soviet Union, shrugged and said, "Do what you want. This is not something that we can get in the way of." And because the Security Council appeared to be working the way it was designed, you get a clear-cut case of aggression. Powerful state invades a weaker state. The international community responds, pushes the stronger state out, restores sovereignty to the weaker state. George Bush Sr. suggests that this is the start of a new world order. Now collective security is going to work the way it was envisioned by Roosevelt, the way it was envisioned by Wilson. The system will now work. While the politics of the Security Council have gotten a little easier, I think it's probably a bit much to say that the vision of Wilson and the vision of Roosevelt for a collective security system is, coming true. We still have that fundamental problem of how do you identify the aggressor? Even if you can get the politics right, even if there are states that are willing to put forward the resources and make the commitment to save someone else, what we end up with is the fact that aggressive states oftentimes seek to disguise their intentions and wrap them in some sort of justification. And sometimes it's just not clear. And so I'd maybe point to the Iran-Iraq war, where it's not a situation where you've got a simple pretext. I think you can make a compelling case either way that both states were the aggressor. And so from the perspective of Iraq, Iran had just gone through a revolution. This was a revolution that was around Shia Islam and a sort of theistic and millennial version of Shia Islam that was supposed to be spread out through the larger Middle East. Iraq has a large Shia population. Its leadership in the 1980s, led by Saddam Hussein, was primarily Sunni, and it was pretty clear that Iran was infiltrating the Shia community, mobilizing the Shia community, that there had been assassination attempts against Saddam Hussein. There was efforts to overthrow him. And so he's looking at this and seeing, a neighboring state that's threatening to topple his government, and therefore he attacks Iran. That's one case, you could argue, in which he's acting in self-defense, and Iran is actually the aggressor and should maybe be punished by the international community. On the flip side, you could look at the situation, say, Iran just went through a revolution. It's going through a period of internal chaos. It lost its superpower client in the United States. All of its military machinery, which it had purchased from the United States, they now can't get parts for because the United States has cut them off, and they've lost sort of military support. Meanwhile, Iraq is getting military support from France and from Russia. It's in a strong position, and it's probably never going to have a better opportunity to attack and defeat a much stronger, much larger neighbor because of this open window of opportunity. And so it strikes and it attacks and it tries to capitalize on a neighbor's moment of weakness. In that version of events, Iran is a weak state in chaos, and Iraq is clearly the aggressor. I don't know which version is true. They both certainly are plausible. They both certainly have facts behind them. It's just really hard to disentangle. And that if we can't figure that out looking back, 20, 30 years after the fact, in the heat of the moment, it's going to be almost impossible for the international community to figure out and dig through who's actually to blame and who's the aggressor. On top of that, we have scenarios in which the permanent 5 members of the Security Council can be aggressive. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in the 1970s, Jimmy Carter was furious and slapped sanctions on the Soviet Union, but there was nothing done through the Security Council. When the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, the Security Council met to discuss whether it should authorize the U.S. invasion, but it never met to discuss whether or not the United States should be stopped and prevented and punished for invading Iraq in 2003. And there was no Security Council effort to save Iraq and push the United States and coalition forces out. Similarly, when Russia invades Georgia in 2007 or carves off Crimea in 2014, the Security Council is essentially ineffective. There's no mechanism to respond when one of the P5 is the aggressor. And you might look at that and say, well, that seems fairly obvious. And in fact, when Roosevelt was explaining how this Security Council system would work to Stalin at the end of World War II, Stalin raised this very possibility. He said, well, what would happen if one of the permanent 5 members were to attack and were to be aggressive? And Roosevelt was, outraged. He said, no, that would never happen. These 5 states, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China, are interested in the stability and the security of the international system. They would never be the aggressor states. And Stalin said, yes, I'm sure you're right. He was recognizing that was a possible scenario and a real limit to the collective security system. And if you're going to have a collective security system work, you need to have states trust that the international community will protect them and the international community will come to their aid. If you want states to not build up their own militaries, seek out their own alliances for defense, if you want them to trust in the international system, this is a really big problem because you have these big gaping holes where there's no way for the system to respond to acts of aggression. Okay, so in spite of all of its problems, in spite of all of its limitations, and in spite of its sort of limited history, the collective security remains part of the system, just a part of the system that is plagued with limitations, problems, and headaches for those who are interested in a more stable system and international security.